As you're building code in Python, you may occasionally make a typo or misplace a punctuation mark or forget a comma or something like that. The Python interpreter will do its best to try to guide you to where the errors are, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. Let's take a look at some examples here. There's a file in your debugging folder called saytime-errors.py. We'll go ahead and make a working copy of this, and we'll call this saytime-errors-working.py. I'll go ahead and open that working copy. And this is the saytime module, and it has some errors in it. And so we'll go ahead and we'll run it and see what happens. And it's flagged a syntax error here. It says syntax error, invalid syntax, and you see that little caret is pointing at the second quote mark on line 26. So we'll scroll down here to line 26, and you see a little red X there. And if I hold my cursor over the red X, we're getting a different error message, and this is because Eclipse is doing its best to help too. So Eclipse is looking at it from the perspective of its syntax highlighting, and Python is actually trying to run the code. So looking at it from two different perspectives, and they're going to give you two different error messages. They both might be helpful and they might not. We're going to focus on the Python error messages here because you're not always going to be coding inside of Eclipse. And the syntax highlighting parser is not always going to be as helpful as the parser that's trying to run the code. So in this case, it's pointing at this character here. So let's see if we can get the entire statement here on the screen. And it starts here with underscore words equals, and it's got this opening curly brace, and that ends down here with this closing curly brace. And so the curly braces mean that this is a dictionary definition. And you see there's our first key and a colon, and there is a tuple object as the value and a comma. So what we have here is a dictionary definition. And we look down here at this line with the error on it, and we see there's a colon there, and there's the quote, and there's the opening quote. It's not really obvious that there's anything wrong with it. That quote does not look like a problem. Even though the syntax error is pointing at that quote does not look like a problem. So let's look at it in order. Let's go through the process of looking at this whole definition and see if we can figure out what's wrong. So this is the first key, and then there's a colon. The value is that whole tuple object, and then there's a comma, and then there's another key and a colon, and then the value, which is another tuple object, and a comma. So we're seeing a pattern here: key, value, comma, key, value, comma. We're getting closer. And here's a key, and here's a value, and there ought to be a comma there because this looks like another key. So we'll put that comma in, and we'll save the file. We notice that the red X goes away. That's a good sign. And we run it. And we get another error message, but this one's on line 70. So it looks like we fixed this syntax error. You see a little red mark over here. That's probably line 70. Sure is. And we have a different error message. This one says indentation error. Unindent does not match any outer indentation level. So it says it's an indentation error. And we see we have another dictionary definition. And all of that looks okay. And you see the little red squiggly marks from the syntax highlighter. It's trying to help us there, but it's actually covering up the problem. You'll notice that under those little red squiggly marks, there's an underscore, and that underscore is indented farther out than the code above it. And so if we push that in one character and then save the file, see the red X goes away. Now we can see that underscore and we can see that indentation level. So that was an indentation error. You notice that it's pointing at the wrong character here. If it was pointing back here, it might have been more obvious. That's typical of parsers everywhere. They'll do their best to show you where the error is, and more often than not, they're off by a few characters and sometimes even a few lines of code. So we'll go ahead and run it again, and now we have another error. And this one says it's on line 118 or line 129. We have two errors being printed out here. And what this is doing actually, if we fill the screen with this is what's called a traceback in Python. It's telling you where it encountered the error, and it's tracing back its execution. So this is actually a runtime error. This is not a syntax error. It says attribute error, built-in function or method, object has no attribute tm_hour. And here it's trying to assign this t.tm_hour to a variable, self.hour, and that's at line 118. So let's take a look at line 118. And there's the line of code. And so what's happening is t here is an object that's getting passed into this constructor in saytime_t. So what's the line above this? Scroll back down here. The line above this is print saytime_t, and this is at line 129. So let's go down to 129, and there it is. And so it's passing this time.localTime, and I happen to know that local time there is a function. It is not an attribute. And so it's correct here. Object has no attribute, tm_hour, and that's because we didn't call it with the function. The function has the attribute. And so if we save this and run it again, now we get something else. This is not printed in red, which means it's not being sent to standard error, which means it's not really a runtime error. This looks more like another kind of an error. It says bound method saytime. This is actually the output of this print statement here. It's printing a bound method rather than running the bound method. So you see here .words. .words is supposed to be a method. It's actually a method in one of our classes here. There it is. See, it's a method here, def words. And so we need to do, see, just like the one up here, it needs to have parentheses. So we'll save that and we'll run it, and our script works as we expected. So that's pretty much the process that you have to go through. If you type a whole bunch of code and it's not working the way that you expect it to work, you need to have some patience. You need to look at it carefully and objectively. And, sometimes for myself, if I'm not seeing it, I'll go and do something else, clear my head, and come back and look at it. And usually at some point after I've cleared my head enough and I look at it enough, the errors will jump out at me. These are the common types of syntax errors that you'll run into in Python, things like forgetting parentheses, indentation errors, forgetting commas, things like that. So you can start with looking for those sorts of things. Just have the patience, try and follow the code in your head, and eventually you ought to be able to find the errors and correct them.